What happens when an inmate turns her own blood into a weapon, infecting 6 prison guards with HIV before mysteriously dying in her cell just days later? Today we uncover a case that exposes the dark intersection of revenge, institutional failure, and a death that raises more questions than answers. Georgia State Women's Correctional Facility sits on the southeast of Atlanta, a sprawling complex of concrete and steel housing over 1,200 female inmates. Built in the 1970s and expanded twice since then, the facility has long struggled with overcrowding and understaffing. By 2018, the prison was operating at 143% capacity, with only 76% of needed staff positions filled. It was within these strained walls that 34-year-old inmate Danielle Rowe would execute a revenge plan that would forever change the lives of 6 corrections officers and expose a system riddled with dangerous failures. Danielle Rowe entered the prison system in 2015 on a 7-year sentence for armed robbery. Her record showed previous convictions for drug possession and assault. Former cellmates described her as intelligent but volatile, someone who kept to herself but could become confrontational when provoked. What many didn't know was that Rowe had been diagnosed with HIV shortly before her incarceration. Danielle wasn't someone who caused trouble without reason, says former inmate Tamika Boone, who shared a cell block with Rowe for over a year. But she had this look in her eyes sometimes, like she was calculating something. She watched everything, especially the guards. The 6 officers who would become victims in this case represented a cross-section of the corrections profession. Officer Matthew Cole, a 29-year-old father of 2, had worked at the facility for just under 3 years. Officer Rachel Nunez, 34, was a single mother supporting 2 children on her corrections salary. Officer Terrence Bell, 41, was a veteran officer with nearly 15 years of service. Officer Dana Reeves, 27, had recently transferred from another facility. Officer Luis Ortega, 36, had a military background before joining corrections. Officer Brielle Sanders, 31, was working to put herself through night school. What connected these 6 individuals beyond their profession was their interaction with Danielle Rowe in the months leading up to the incidents. Throughout late 2017 and early 2018, multiple incident reports documented increasing tension between Rowe and these specific officers. Officer Cole had written Rowe up for contraband violations 3 times. Officer Nunez had denied Rowe's requests for special privileges. Officer Bell had been involved in a physical restraint of Rowe following an altercation with another inmate. Officers Reeves, Ortega, and Sanders had all documented behavioral issues with Rowe in the months preceding the attacks. The system was already stretched to the breaking point, explains investigator Colleen Mears, who would later lead the case investigation. Warning signs were missed because everyone was just trying to keep their heads above water. Warden Cheryl Langford had been running the facility for 8 years by this point. Known for her strict management style, Langford had repeatedly requested additional funding and staffing from the Department of Corrections, with limited success. Former employees describe a leadership focused more on maintaining appearances than addressing underlying problems. Nurse Eric Dawson, one of only 3 full-time medical staff for the entire facility, had noted Rowe's declining mental state in her medical file, but later admitted that proper follow-up was impossible given his caseload of hundreds of inmates. What finally triggered Rowe's plan remains somewhat unclear, but multiple sources point to an incident in early March 2018 when Rowe was denied emergency medical attention for what she claimed was severe abdominal pain. Officer Cole was on duty that night and determined her complaint wasn't serious enough to warrant calling in medical staff after hours. 3 days later, on March 7, 2018, the first attack occurred. Officer Matthew Cole was conducting routine cell checks when Rowe called him over. If you're enjoying this story, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. It is free and won't cost anything, but it means the world to us. We're just a small channel trying to grow. Thank you, and back to the video. Claiming she needed to show him something important. As he approached her cell, Rowe lunged forward with a makeshift weapon. A toothbrush with a razor blade melted into the handle and managed to slash Cole's forearm through the cell bars. What made this attack different from typical prison violence was what happened next. Rowe pulled out a small container of her own blood and flung it directly into Cole's face, specifically targeting his eyes and an open wound from the slash. "I've been waiting for you," witnesses heard Rowe say. "Now we're blood brothers. I've got HIV. Welcome to my world." Cole immediately reported the incident, but the seriousness of the biological exposure wasn't fully grasped initially. He was sent to the infirmary where Nurse Dawson cleaned the wounds and filed a standard incident report. No HIV prophylaxis treatment was started, a critical early failure that would later become central to lawsuits against the facility. The next day, March 8th, Officer Rachel Nunez became the second victim. During medication distribution, Rowe had concealed another container of blood and managed to splash it directly into Nunez's face as she approached Rowe's cell. Unlike the first attack, no physical wound was inflicted, but the blood made contact with Nunez's eyes and mouth. "I remember her laughing," Nunez later testified. She said, "Tell your kids their mommy's got something special now." By this point, Warden Langford had been notified of both incidents, but remarkably, no facility-wide alert was issued. Later investigation would reveal that Langford made the decision to handle the matter discreetly to avoid, in her words, unnecessary panic. This decision would prove catastrophic. On March 9th, Officer Terrence Bell became the third victim when Rowe, who had somehow retained her privileges to work in the laundry facility despite the previous incidents, managed to hide behind equipment and surprise Bell with another blood attack, this time using a syringe she had obtained from the medical waste disposal. She knew exactly what she was doing, Bell later told investigators. "She made sure the needle broke off in my arm before injecting the blood. She told me she'd been planning this for months." By March 10th, rumors were spreading among the corrections staff, but incredibly, no official warning had been issued to all personnel. This communication failure led directly to the fourth attack on Officer Dana Reeves, who was unaware of the previous incidents when she approached Rowe's cell during count. The fifth and sixth attacks occurred in quick succession on March 11th, targeting officers Luis Ortega and Brielle Sanders during meal distribution. By this point, Rowe had been moved to isolation, but not before she had prepared additional blood containers that she had hidden throughout the facility with the help of another inmate. She turned her own illness into a weapon, explains forensic psychologist Dr. Amelia Walsh, who reviewed the case. In her mind, she was delivering a very specific form of justice against people she believed had wronged her. Only after all 6 officers had been exposed did Warden Langford issue a facility-wide alert and contact outside authorities. The delay in proper medical response meant that critical time for post-exposure prophylaxis had been lost for several of the victims. Investigator Colleen Mears arrived at the facility on March 12th to find a scene of barely controlled chaos. Officers were refusing to report for shifts, inmates were largely confined to cells due to understaffing, and medical testing was being hastily arranged for all 6 victims. "The first thing that struck me was the fear," Mears recalls. "Not just from the victims, but from everyone. The idea that your blood could be weaponized, it creates a unique kind of terror." As Mears began gathering evidence, including security footage and witness statements, media reports began to surface about the attacks. The story quickly gained national attention, with headlines focusing on the deliberate HIV exposures and questions about how one inmate had managed to attack 6 officers over 5 days without being stopped. Then, on the morning of March 15th, just as criminal charges were being prepared against her, Danielle Rowe was found dead in her isolation cell. Initial reports from Warden Langford described the death as apparently natural causes and suggested that Rowe's compromised immune system may have been a factor. The official statement indicated that Rowe had been under appropriate medical observation and that all protocols were followed. But from the beginning, aspects of Rowe's death didn't add up. The isolation cell where Rowe died was supposed to be under constant video surveillance, but footage from the 8 hours preceding her death was found to be missing due to what was described as a system malfunction. The guard assigned to monitor her section reported making all required checks, but log entries appeared to have been altered. And perhaps most troubling, the preliminary autopsy findings didn't support natural causes. There were unexplained bruises on her wrists and neck, a source close to the medical examiner's office later revealed. And toxicology showed sedative levels far beyond what her prescribed medications should have produced. As the investigation into both the attacks and Rowe's death continued, the 6 infected officers were facing their own nightmare. Initial testing confirmed that Rowe was indeed HIV positive with a high viral load at the time of the attacks. All 6 officers began aggressive antiretroviral treatment while awaiting their own test results. The psychological trauma was immediate and profound, says Dr. Lydia Morgan, who counseled several of the victims. These were people who got up every morning to do a difficult job, and suddenly they're facing a life-altering diagnosis and wondering if they might have already infected their families before knowing their status. Officer Matthew Cole described the waiting period as psychological torture. His wife and children had to be tested as well, adding another layer of fear and guilt to his experience. Officer Rachel Nunez faced the prospect of explaining the situation to her children while still processing it herself. "How do you tell your kids that mommy might have a disease that people still stigmatize and fear?" she said in a later interview. For the families of all 6 officers, questions about the facility's failures became increasingly urgent. Why wasn't Rowe's HIV status factored into security protocols? Why weren't officers warned after the first attack? Why wasn't proper medical treatment provided immediately? 2 weeks after Rowe's death, a breakthrough in the case came from an unexpected source. Marla Eaton, an administrative assistant in the warden's office, contacted investigator Mears with information she claimed had been deliberately suppressed. According to Eaton, Warden Langford had been aware of Rowe's threats against specific officers for weeks before the first attack. Rowe had sent a detailed letter to the warden outlining her intentions, specifically naming all 6 officers who would later become victims. The warden didn't want documentation of threats she ignored coming back to haunt her, Eaton claimed, providing copies of the letter and subsequent internal memos discussing how to handle the situation without creating a paper trail that could lead to liability. Further investigation revealed that Nurse Dawson had also raised concerns about Rowe's declining mental state and increased hostility, specifically noting that her HIV status could present a unique security concern if she became violent. These warnings, too, had apparently been dismissed by administration. Perhaps most disturbing were the circumstances surrounding Rowe's death. Security logs obtained by investigator Mears showed unauthorized access to the isolation area where Rowe was held during the period when video surveillance was malfunctioning. 2 prison employees not assigned to that area had used their key cards to enter shortly after midnight, remaining for approximately 17 minutes. "We're not just looking at institutional negligence anymore," Mears stated in her interim report. "We're potentially looking at a coordinated effort to silence someone who had become extremely dangerous to the facility's reputation and leadership." As the investigation continued, more details emerged about Danielle Rowe's motives through testimony from her former cellmate, Tamika Boone. "Danielle found out she had HIV right before she went to prison," Boone revealed. "She always said the system took everything from her health, her freedom, her dignity. She talked about making them pay, but specifically the ones who treated her like she wasn't human." According to Boone, Rowe had been systematically collecting and storing her blood for months, hiding small containers throughout the facility. She had studied the officers' routines, identifying vulnerabilities in their procedures. The plan wasn't impulsive, it was calculated over a long period. She knew exactly who she wanted to target and why, Boone explained. Officer Cole had denied her medical care multiple times. Nunez had kept her from calling her dying mother. Bell had used excessive force during a restraint. Each one had done something specific that Danielle couldn't forgive. For months after the attacks, preliminary test results brought some relief. 5 of the 6 officers tested negative for HIV. Officer Luis Ortega, however, tested positive, though whether this was a result of Rowe's attack or predated it remained unclear due to testing limitations. The legal aftermath expanded rapidly. All 6 officers filed lawsuits against the Georgia Department of Corrections, Warden Langford personally, and several other administrators. The suits alleged gross negligence, deliberate indifference to known risks, failure to warn, and violations of workplace safety laws. The criminal investigation into Rowe's death remained officially open but stalled. Key witnesses within the facility either changed their stories or refused to cooperate further. The missing security footage was never recovered. The medical examiner's final report listed the cause of death as undetermined, noting that while the toxicology results were abnormal, they couldn't definitively rule out self-administration of the substances found in her system. Warden Langford resigned 6 months after the incidents, citing personal reasons and declining all interview requests. Nurse Dawson accepted a position at another facility before the investigation concluded. And investigator Mears was eventually reassigned to other cases, though she continued to pursue leads in the Rowe case unofficially. For the 6 officers and their families, the quest for answers and accountability continued. Officer Matthew Cole became an advocate for correctional reform, frequently speaking about the systemic failures that allowed the attacks to happen. This wasn't just about one disturbed inmate, he often says in his presentations. This was about a system that ignored warnings, cut corners, and then tried to cover it all up. Officer Rachel Nunez never returned to corrections work, the psychological impact of the experience proving too great. "I still have nightmares about it," she shared. "Not just about the HIV exposure, but about working in a place where your safety means so little to the people in charge." The case prompted legislative hearings on prison safety protocols, particularly regarding inmates with communicable diseases who make specific threats. Several states implemented new training and response protocols directly citing the Rowe case as motivation. What do you think really happened in the isolation cell where Danielle Rowe died? Was it natural causes exacerbated by her condition? A suicide enabled by contraband medications? Or something more troubling? The evidence points in multiple directions, and we'd like to hear your theories in the comments below. The legacy of the Danielle Rowe case extends beyond the immediate victims and perpetrator. It forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about our correctional system. How do we balance security with humane treatment? What responsibility do facilities have to protect both inmates and staff? And how often are warnings ignored until tragedy makes them impossible to dismiss? For the Georgia State Women's Correctional Facility, the aftermath brought significant changes. Staffing was increased by 22% within a year. Medical protocols were completely overhauled, with clear guidelines for handling biological exposure incidents. A new electronic reporting system was implemented that prevents incident reports from being buried or altered. Yet for many observers, these changes came too late. 6 lives were forever altered by exposure to a deadly virus. An inmate died under suspicious circumstances, and questions remain about how high the cover-up went and who ultimately bears responsibility. The truth about what happened to Danielle Rowe may never be fully known, investigator Mears reflected in a rare interview years after the case. But what we do know for certain is that multiple failures had to align for this tragedy to occur. No single person could have prevented it, but many people working together properly absolutely could have. The case also highlighted the complex legal and ethical issues surrounding HIV criminalization. While deliberately exposing others to HIV is unquestionably harmful, many advocates argue that treating HIV differently from other communicable diseases in the criminal justice system perpetuates stigma and discrimination. For Officer Luis Ortega, who continues to manage his HIV with medication, the focus remains on accountability. "I don't care as much about punishing Rowe anymore," he says. "She's gone. But the people who let this happen, who knew about the threats and did nothing, who tried to hide evidence afterward, they need to be held responsible." As we conclude this examination of the Danielle Rowe case, we're left with a mosaic of human failures: institutional negligence, personal revenge, administrative cover-up, and the devastating consequences when systems designed to maintain safety collapse. What aspects of this case do you find most disturbing? The premeditated nature of Rowe's attacks? The facility's failure to protect its staff? The mysterious circumstances of Rowe's death? Share your thoughts in the comments section. Some questions may never be fully answered. Did Danielle Rowe act alone, or did she have help from others within the facility? Did she intend from the beginning for her plan to end with her own death? And what really happened in that isolation cell during the 17 minutes when unauthorized personnel were present and cameras weren't recording? The search for complete justice continues for the victims and their families. 3 of the 6 lawsuits remain active in the court system, slowly working their way toward potential trials. Advocacy groups continue to push for nationwide prison reforms inspired by the case. And somewhere, perhaps, evidence exists that could finally reveal the full truth about what happened at Georgia State Women's Correctional Facility in those fateful days of March 2018. If you found this case compelling, be sure to like and subscribe for more true crime stories that expose the complex intersections of justice, human psychology, and institutional failures. Your engagement helps us continue bringing these important narratives to light.